Support for this podcast comes from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative, connecting communities with the resources, infrastructure, and networks to ensure a vibrant local free press.
From KVPR in Fresno, this is Central Valley Daily. It's Monday, March 3rd. I'm Elizabeth Arkalian. Coming up, a Fresno native talks about orchestrating music for hit films you see on the big screen.
I love all the projects I do because they're so varied and often challenging, but always satisfactorily so.
We'll speak with Jeff Atamajian to learn more about what it means to be an orchestrator. But first, these news headlines. California's third snowpack survey of the year showed a slight improvement in snowpack levels. Cap Radio's Manola Secaida has the breakdown on Friday's measurement.
Researchers at Phillips Station near Lake Tahoe saw 34 inches of snow, which amounts to 58% of average. It's also 55% of the April 1st average, when snowpack typically peaks. Andy Rising manages the state's snow surveys and water supply forecasting unit. He says February's storms boosted statewide snowpack levels, which are at 85% of the norm. But recent warmer temperatures have started to chip away at that progress.
Every day it's not actively snowing or raining, we're likely losing ground. The expectation is that we are still in a part of the winter where we should be gaining our snowpack up until about April 1st, so the percent of average will decrease each day that we are not seeing any accumulation.
Rising says Northern California has the highest levels of snowpack, sitting at 104% of the average. But central and southern regions saw fewer storms this month and are still struggling with lower than average numbers. In Sacramento, I'm Manola Secaida.
California has two small guaranteed income pilot programs, which give people monthly checks with no requirements on how to spend them. One is for former foster youth and pregnant people, and another is for older adults. Now lawmakers are considering expanding them with permanent funding. Riverside Democratic Assembly member Corey Jackson.
I do believe that guaranteed income is a part of a 21st century social safety net to fill in the gaps that other more stringent programs aren't able to meet.
Some opponents call it redistribution. Here's Susan Shelley with the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association.
A guaranteed income program that's funded by philanthropy from voluntary donations is fine. But a guaranteed income program funded by taking money out of other people's checks and redistributing it through the government is not fine.
A new bill by two Assembly Democrats calls for the state to study how to expand the program. A new state bill is aiming to help California farmers and their employees. It would offer a tax rebate to farmers who pay overtime wages to agricultural workers. Senate Bill 628 was introduced by Republican Shannon Grove. She's a state senator representing parts of the Valley and Sierra. Current law requires farmers to offer overtime pay to those working more than 40 hours a week. But critics say some farms couldn't afford overtime pay and chose to reduce employees' hours as a result. Grove says her proposed tax credit is a, quote, common sense solution. The Big Fresno Fair is canceling a century-old tradition. Officials told news media last week there will be no horse racing at this year's fair. The decision comes after 3 racehorses died last year. Animal rights groups say the horses' deaths were never properly investigated by the California Authority of Racing Fairs. That's the organization that puts on horse races across the state. The organization's board voted not to organize races in several cities this year. While fairs can still theoretically organize their own horse races, officials in Fresno say it's not financially feasible without the board's help.
Looking for a way to support KVPR but can't write that big check at the moment? What about that old unwanted car in the driveway? Your vehicle donation could net hundreds of dollars for KVPR. It's easy. We'll tow it away free of charge, KVPR gets a check, and you'll get a receipt for your taxes. And we can take RVs, boats, and motorcycles too. Find out more at kvpr.org/cars or call 855-277-2346.
And now to our main story. Whether you are happy or upset over the results of last night's Oscars, we can all agree film music is an important part of the movies we watch. It can exhilarate us, build tension, or soften a moment between characters on screen. Some people have their favorite film composers, but what about their favorite orchestrators and conductors? Jeff Atamajian is both of those things. He's a Fresno native who's brought music to life through orchestral arrangements. He's done this work for major movies, including the hit musical Wicked. Last night, Wicked was up for 10 Oscar nominations, including Best Original Musical Score. Unfortunately, it did not win in the Best Original Score category, but it did take home 2 Oscars, one for Best Costume Design and the other for Best Production Design. Before the Oscars, we sat down with Jeff to learn more about what inspired his musical talent. He graduated with a degree in composition at Fresno State. Then at 23, he moved to Los Angeles to study music at the University of Southern California. Since then, he's worked on many films, too many to count, from The Dark Knight to romantic comedies like You've Got Mail. When we spoke over Zoom recently, Jeff was in London and had just conducted a 30-piece orchestra for the popular British TV show Call the Midwife. He starts out our conversation by telling us how he explains his job to others.
It's not always easy to explain. I did an event in Fresno you may know about a few weeks ago, a town hall, and something I do with students where I show a piece of piano music. I picked a piece of Beethoven, and then I slowly orchestrate it to a greater degree where you start to see how it diverges or increases or from the original and yet honors the original. So it's never an easy thing to describe to people, but basically I say my role can be anything from taking another person's, in the case of films, the film composer I work for, their sketch, which could be fairly complete in terms of what they're hoping the final sound of the orchestra will be, meaning they give somewhat clear instruction, or it could be fairly sketchy. And it's up to me to decide, all the different ways to fill it out dramatically, coloristically. It involves composition as much as deciding what instruments to give to different parts.
You have worked on a lot of films over the past 3 decades. Any particularly memorable ones to you and why? I'd love to know.
Well, yes, I don't know if you want me to start from the distant past or from the recent and go backwards. Do you have a preference?
Let's start with the recent and go backwards.
Okay, never a bad idea. I mean, as you may know, I worked on the first Wicked film, which is doing very well. And in that film, as you know, it's a musical with many songs and it has score. In this case, I worked on only the songs. I arranged and orchestrated all of them, and I'm now embarking on the second one because it was done in 2 parts. And most of the time, what I work on is the underscore. And in other film musicals, I've done both. So Wicked is a well-known one. I've worked on both the Joker films, which were completely different and very interesting as well. I wouldn't know where to begin. I love all the projects I do because they're so varied and often challenging, but always satisfactorily so. But then I always forget all the things I've done. I've worked on all the Hunger Games films, the Fantastic Beasts films, The Dark Knight, going back in time, You've Got Mail, Chocolat, Groundhog Day, The American President, too many to recall.
So many. It's worth looking you up and looking up everything you've worked on. It's really so fantastic. I'd love for you to describe for people at really what point in a film's production does the music's role that you're working on start to take shape? Is that something you're discussing at the beginning, or has the film been edited and you're coming in after the fact? Just logistically, what's your work like?
It's a very good question, and I wouldn't say it's somewhere in between the 2 things you described. It's nearer to the second thing. We always seem to come in at the end. The film ideally is edited, but sometimes it's not final edited. So we might write music that could need to be, readjusted if the picture gets a final edit that comes after. But almost always the film is shot, put together in some form, and that's when the composer works with the director, and then I come in near the very end because we usually have only a few weeks to get all the composer's music ready for the orchestra to play.
And dialing back to Wicked, since that's been such a phenomenon culturally, not just as a film, what was that like to work on a project like that? I mean, there was a lot of marketing and press even before the movie was released. Like, people knew this was going to be really big. Are you working with teams of people, and does that anticipation make the work fun? Does that crank up the pressure? What was that like?
Oh, goodness, good question. Well, first of all, when I was approached by head of Universal Music, I didn't know much about Wicked except for I'd seen it once in London 20 years ago. So I wasn't really aware of all the promotion going on and such. I just know after a few months, they finally sent me some music and I got going on it. And I just kind of worked, I'm going to make a pun here, in a bubble. And I made a pun because the two first songs they gave me, The Wizard and I, and the other one called The Girl in the Bubble, which I think I'm allowed to speak about, but I better be careful because it's in the second film. Anyway, it was the first thing I worked on. And being a new song, I guess to answer your question, there were a team of us on a music team and the director, and we would have weekly meetings. But mostly I was left to do, they kind of wanted me to give my take on the songs, even though I told them I really didn't remember anything about the original musical, and they seemed okay with that. And I kind of liked it. I felt like I was somebody that could bring a fresh, kind of perspective.
Absolutely, because a lot of folks do have an attachment to that production because it's been such a long stage production. So that's really interesting.
Yes, and in a way, I would have possibly been intimidated, if that's the right word, by everybody's kind of love for the way they knew it. And it's been really nice to hear from people that they feel that this film and the music all still honors the musical and yet takes it to another level. And I met with John Chu, the director, before anybody else, and he said to me he wanted it cinematic, and that's why they hired me. He didn't want it to sound like just like, the group that you use in a musical.
Sure. Not just a reproduction, but yeah, not having preconceived notions, I can imagine, was a benefit in that circumstance. And is there anything you wish more people knew about film music? Do you feel, I'd be curious to know from your perspective in the movie industry, do you feel that this type of work you do is overlooked by audiences, or is it very nurtured by the movie industry that you do feel fulfilled?
Well, it's a mix of both. First of all, the audience, in some ways, shouldn't really be overly aware of it. The music is to bring a two-dimensional thing into even a greater dimension, because as you know, it's a whole other spectrum of reaching people, the vibrations and such. So in one way, we want the music to amplify the film experience without taking away from it. But I do love when the film allows for musical themes to be given to an audience, and I would hope they would notice those. And what I really hope is they demand quality, because I think there's a range of kind of music on offer, and I love it when, well, let's just say when music gets to be its best self.
That was my conversation with Jeff Atmajian. He's a film conductor and orchestrator, and he's also a Fresno native. And that's today's show. Today's episode was produced by Jonathan Linden and KVPR with support from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative. I'm Elizabeth Arkalian. Find the latest local news anytime at kvpr.org.
Each morning, it's a new opportunity, a chance to start fresh. Up First from NPR makes each morning an opportunity to learn and to understand. Choose to join the world every morning with Up First, a podcast that hands you everything going on across the globe and down the street, all in 15 minutes or less. Start your day informed and anew with Up First by subscribing wherever you get your podcasts.